Welcome back to Making Sense of Revelation for part 5. In case you didn't know, my name is 479. And if you're wondering what I mean by that, then listen in, because you'll find out as we go through. As I always say, there's a handout available in the description to download. If you have any trouble getting it, let me know and I can send it your way. So today we're going to try out our new interpretive wheels. So in the last few parts we've given ourselves a context for the book, which means we now have a framework to understand it. It's very helpful for us because it limits, as we go through and look at the symbols, it limits how subjective we can be. So it limits the scope of what the meaning of these symbols are. We can't just say it's anything. So for instance, when people read about the hordes of locusts in Revelation chapter 9 with lions' teeth and men's faces, you get some people that say these represent Apache helicopters. We can say up front, no, it isn't. We don't even need to give any exegetical evidence to show why Apache helicopters don't match the description, because before we even get to exegetical evidence, we have to ask, what relevance do Apache helicopters have to the people that John is writing to, or with the fall of Jerusalem? Now, I'm not going to spend any time saying what I do think the locusts in Revelation 9 represent, but I'd be more than happy to give an answer if anyone was curious. But I'm more trying to say that we've got a framework now that we can view these symbols thing. It limits how far it can go. And so this is really helpful for us. In fact, one of the problems with interpreting Revelation over the many hundreds of years of church history is that people have read it very subjectively from their time period, as though they must be the ones living in the times for the book for which the book was written. And obviously history moves on, and then the next generation said it was about their time, and so on. So nowadays, a reaction to this, a very popular position, is to say that none of these events are addressed to a particular time period. They're just timeless symbols that address every period of history. But it really doesn't seem like that. John has expectations for these events. The way he writes about them show that they correspond to a reality. And we've seen that that reality is God's judgment on Jerusalem. And so in the next 2 parts, we're going to take our new interpretive wheels for a spin, as I say. We're going to see how 2 of the main characters in Revelation fit into this story, into this drama, which means seeing how they are relevant to John's audience and relevant to the destruction of Jerusalem. So today we're going to look at the beasts of Revelation. There's actually 2 beasts. People often only talk about the beast of Revelation. But we're going to talk about the 2 beasts of Revelation, which means we're going to look at that infamous number 666 and get some clarification on what it really means. So if you've ever wondered, what is 666, the number of the beast? What does it mean? Well, as I say, listen in and we'll do it. So we're going to be almost entirely in Revelation chapter 13 in this part. So if you have your Bible, please do open it to Revelation chapter 13. I'm going to read the whole chapter for us now. Okay, so Revelation chapter 13 goes like this. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marvelled as they followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. And it was also allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all who dwell on earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. Here is a call for endurance and faith of the saints. Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak, and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So there's quite a lot in that passage, a lot of symbols and a lot of things to get into. And if you're confused, well, you won't be the first person. But there's a few things we need to get in there to work out the meaning, and I'll list them in a minute. But first, it's important to know that when the Bible talks about beasts, it's talking about political powers. So in Daniel, which John is heavily referring to and building on here, there are two occasions where Daniel has visions of empires that are defeated and replaced by God's kingdom. So in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel sees a vision where 4 beasts arise in turn and respectively collapse until God arises and never is defeated. Later in the chapter, Daniel asks for an interpretation of this vision, and Daniel's told that these beasts are great kings. And then just a few verses down, it says that these beasts are great kingdoms. And so that's really important to remember, that the beasts are a symbol for great kingdoms, but can also represent the kings that rule those empires. It's there in Daniel, and as we'll see, John does the same thing in Revelation too. So the beasts are political powers, but sometimes they're the rulers that lead those political powers. It kind of changes between the two. So we know that these beasts are kingdoms or empires, and let's look at the first beast before we look at the second one. Now bear in mind that as we read this, some of these things are given as a description to John's audience so that they can identify the beast, and some of these things are given as prophecy to know what to expect from the beast. Okay? So there's a few questions that we might have. Why is this beast rising out of the sea? What is its mortal wound? Why does it have 7 heads? Well, let's look at some interpretive clues for some answers to these questions. The 10 crowns in verse 1, this is royal imagery. The verse 4, who can fight against it? This talks about the military might of this empire. We see it's given its power by Satan, so it has a demonic authority in verse 2. It persecutes the church in verse 7. It demands divine worship in verse 8 and verse 14. And in chapter 17, if we turn to chapter 17 quickly, we see in verse 9 of chapter 17, it says, this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. So in chapter 17, we're told that its 7 heads represent 7 hills. And it's also said that there's 7 kings. Well, there's really only one contender, the Roman Empire, with a special focus on Emperor Nero. Why is that? Well, let me draw some of these dots together for us. So the most obvious clue that we're given is the 7 hills reference. So if you've ever been to Rome, you will know that it is known as the city of 7 hills, the city on the 7 hills. And even today, the city is known for it, but in the ancient world, even more so. The 7 hills were a very distinctive trait of Rome. So that's a really major part. Along with that, we're given this royal imagery with the 10 crowns and the military might. Now that's quite self-explanatory. You know, the Roman Empire is known for its impressive strength. It's one of the biggest empires ever, and it's certainly the biggest in the 1st century. So having looked at these things, and these are only a couple things, but quite major clues which show us that it's the Roman Empire, let's take a quick re-look at the passage and work out some of these other images. So first we see that the beast rises out of the sea. Now this is an image from the perspective of one in Jerusalem, which sits by the Mediterranean. And so as the Romans come to Jerusalem, they're coming out of the sea. It's like they're rising out of the water. And then we see that Satan is the one behind their authority. Now, believe me, take any time to read about Emperor Nero and you will not struggle to see there was definitely satanic, demonic activity there. And I'll talk about some of the things that he did a bit later on. Then we see that he has a mortal wound. It says one of the heads had a mortal wound and it seemed that the beast was dying. Now, this is an amazing bit of prophecy. Now, bear in mind that we're told in chapter 17, as I said earlier, that the 7 heads represent both the 7 hills, but also the 7 kings. And in part 1, we saw that the 7 kings fit with the 7 emperors up to the point that John is writing. So the 6th king is Nero. Now, what we see here is that one head has a mortal wound, and it seems that the beast is going to die. And in verse 14, it tells us it died from the sword. Well, what's going on here? As I said in part 1, Nero killed himself with his own sword. But what I didn't go particularly in depth on is that after he died, the world thought that that was the Roman Empire dead. He had no heir, he was the last in line of Julius Caesar, and so his death left Rome in a civil war. And it launched what often gets called the Year of the 4 Emperors, where, as the name would suggest, 4 people were emperor in 1 year because they kept getting assassinated. It was a real period of unrest, and as I say, people thought the Roman Empire was done for. After this period, a man called Vespasian came, and he restored order to Rome. He restored it from its death throes, and it was considered like Rome had returned from the dead, so Roman historians talk about it as though Rome was brought back to life. So this prophecy is about Nero killing himself, leaving Rome in a power vacuum in the Civil War, and everyone thought that was the Roman Empire dead until it was restored order, and so everyone marvelled as the beast came back to life. That's what John's talking about here, it's what John's prophesying. So what else is there? Well, this is very key, because now that we've established that it's Rome, let's ask, what's it doing in Revelation? What's it doing in this drama? We see that it was given authority to blaspheme God and to make war against the saints for 42 months. That's in verse 5. This is the same number that we saw last time in part 4, which described the destruction of the temple. That was in chapter 11. But is this 42-month period the same as the 42-month period in chapter 11? Well, I don't think so. Let me give you some background. So in 64 AD, there was a great fire that tore through Rome. And many believed that Emperor Nero had started it, or at least ordered it. He had plans to renovate the city, he had new complexes he wanted to build, and so he decided to burn part of it up in order to make way for his plans. But immediately backlash began and people revolted against him, and so he needed a scapegoat. And so he chose the Christians, he blamed it on them. And so thus began the Roman persecution of the church. It began in late November 64 AD, and it lasted until Nero's death in early June 68. It began in November 64 AD, and it lasted until Nero's death in early June 68 AD. You'll never guess how long that is. 42 months. Now, I should say at this point, I think our assumption when we come to numbers like this in Revelation should be that we assume they're symbolic, they're rounded numbers. But when historical events line up so perfectly with what's described, I don't think it's just a massive coincidence. John prophesies it'll be 42 months of persecution, and there was 42 months of persecution. Now, this Neronic persecution, the persecution from Nero, is very significant. It's one of the first major and state-led persecutions of the church. It's what earned Nero's nickname, the Tyrant. And early Christians, even hundreds of years on, would reflect on this impact that it had on the church. Other emperors did smaller and less specific persecutions towards Christians, but there was nothing like Nero's. So, for instance, Emperor Domitian, who, if the late date of Revelation is correct, you remember there was 2 views and I've gone with the early date. If the late date is correct, Domitian would have been the emperor at the time of Revelation's writing. Now, he had a brief period of paranoia where he thought that there were all these people who were trying to take his throne from him. And so he imprisoned lots of people, and some of them happened to be Christians. But it wasn't a persecution of the church, it was a persecution of people that he deemed threats, some of whom were in the church. In fact, after he discovered that Christians weren't a threat, he just let them all go free. He wasn't bothered by them anymore. So it wasn't really a persecution of the church, it was more a brief period of paranoia. But anyway, back to Nero's persecution. This is a really big deal. This is a focused persecution on the church. This is how Tacitus, who is a historian in Rome at the time of Nero, this is how he described his persecution of the church. Therefore, to squash the rumour that he had started the fire, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd referred to as Christians. Christ, the founder of the group, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius, by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. First then, people who admitted to be members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosures, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the count of arson, but for hatred of the human race. And derision accompanied their end. They were covered with wild beast skins, and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses. And when daylight faded, they were burned to serve as candles by night. Nero had offered his gardens for the spectacle, and gave an exhibition in his circus, mixing with the crowd in the habit of a charioteer, or mounted on his car. Hence, in spite of a guilt which had earned the most exemplary punishment, yet there arose a sentiment of pity among the people, due to the impression that these Christians were being sacrificed not for the good of Rome, but to satisfy the viciousness of a single man, Nero. So these Christians were killed, tortured, burned as human candles. Nero was so vicious to them that the crowd even began to feel pity to people who they thought were guilty of crimes against humanity. Now, I think just a minor note when we read these things is that sometimes we can hear these as just mere historical fact. But let's remember that even though these people lived thousands of years ago, we've never met them, these are our brothers and sisters in the Lord who we will spend eternity with, and they're the ones we're hearing about now. I just wanted to make that point briefly. This isn't just historical fact. But you can see that he really was a vicious persecutor of God's people. It just evidences that it was Satan pulling all the strings. Now, according to Revelation, it's during this 42-month period that Christians are pressured to worship the beast, which Nero did indeed do. So the cult of the emperor had been steadily growing since Emperor Augustus, some 50 years earlier, and he took on the title Son of God. In fact, one of the reasons why Luke and Acts are seen as so daringly provocative in their historical context is because they constantly use phrases which were applied to Caesar, but applied them to Jesus. So things like the good news of the Son of God, and Caesar is Lord, and there is no other name under heaven by which you may be saved. These were all sayings about the Caesar. Open up Luke, open up Acts, and you'll find these things not about Caesar, but about Jesus. It's very provocative. Anyway, Nero really cashed in heavily on all this divine worship of emperors. He had coins minted that portrayed him as the god Mars, and he accepted praise as Apollos incarnate. He was the beast that demanded worship. And this is going on when John is writing. Bear in mind, this persecution is about halfway through when John is writing this book. And so here, John's listeners are encouraged. They're currently in this persecution, and they're told, here is a call for endurance and the faith of the saints. In other words, I know it's hard, but don't give in. Worship God who can save you even from death. So that's obviously that's really helpful for identifying the beast and seeing this prophecy here. But let's move on now to the classic number. What could be meant by 666? All kinds of theories have been thrown out there in the past. Like, for instance, 7 is the Jewish number of perfection. So saying 7 3 times is like saying holy, holy, holy. So 6 is falling short of perfection. And so saying 666 is like a major falling short of perfection. Another theory, very popular in America, is that if you look at a barcode, the first number on the code is a 6, the middle number is a 6, and the final number is a 6. And so they link barcodes with the mark of the beast, and they say the mark of the beast is a microchip. And in the next few years, people are going to have to get microchips implanted, and you won't be able to buy or sell without it. And so the number of the beast is to do with barcodes. Now, I'm just not convinced by either of these views or any of the other popular views, and there's a couple of reasons why all of these fall down. The first reason is that the number given is not actually 666, it's 666. Now, in Greek, you might say, well, that's not really much difference, it's just about pronunciation, but in Greek, these look very different because the letters are spelled out. So it doesn't say, if it was saying 666 in Greek, it would say hex, 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 but it doesn't say that. It says 666. Second reason is that some of the oldest and most ancient manuscripts of Revelation don't even have this number 666. They have 616. This is what's called a textual variant. So that two different manuscripts that have a slight difference. Now we have to be able to deal with that. Whatever 666 means, it must also make sense with 616. The third reason is that the number was actually understandable by people in John's day. If you read verse 18, it says, "This calls for wisdom, let the one who has understanding calculate it." So he was giving it to people who could understand it. The fourth reason is that this number relates to a specific person. In verse 18, we're told it is the number of a man. The fifth reason is that the number is given is so they know who John is talking about. The number is given to reveal something, not conceal it. And the sixth reason is that it's part of the drama about Jerusalem's fall. It's not about our world today. It fits within that context that we talked about. So, is there an answer that satisfies all these caveats? Well, yes, there certainly is. I'm going to introduce you to a system that they had in the ancient world called gematria. Okay, so gematria. Now, in English, we have an alphabet for our letters and a numerical system for our numbers. So we have A, B, C, and 1, 2, 3, right? In the ancient world, in languages like Latin, Hebrew, and Greek, they didn't have this. They used their letters as their numbers. So if you think of Roman numerals, for instance, like an X is a 10 and an I is a 1. These are Roman numerals. And they're using their letters as numbers. But in Hebrew and Greek, the numbers corresponded to the order of the alphabet. So like this, you can see that the first letter there is 1, the second is 2, so it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it gets to 10, and it goes 10, 20, 30, 40, and then it gets to 100, and goes 100, 200, and so on. And so what people used to do was add up the numbers of their name to form a code number. So, for instance, I've done it in English here. So you can see it goes 1 to 10, 10 to 100, and then 200 down to 800. Now, if you add up the letters of my name, so my name is Joshua, if you add up mine, you have a J, which is 10, an O, which is 60, an S, which is 100, an H, which is an 8, a U, which is 300, and an A, which is a 1. So my name, my code number is 479, which is why I introduced myself at the beginning as 479. In fact, why don't we have a bit of fun with this? Why don't you work out what your number is and let me know, and maybe I can refer to you by your code number from now on. Anyway, archaeologists have found graffiti in Pompeii where it says, "I love her whose number is 545." Things like that. It was a common thing that people did. As I say, it's called gematria. You can Google it and you can find plenty of examples. And people got very creative with it. They would make poems where the rest of the poem had the same value as the person that the poem was about. They got all kind of intricate things that came with it. Now, because different languages had slightly different lettering and nuances, you could get very different values depending on what alphabet you used. Now, here's what's really interesting. According to the Hebrew spelling of Caesar Nero, which is Kaiser Neron or Neron Kaiser, you end up with the number 666, 666. Add all his letters together and you have that. But what about that textual variant we saw, 616? Well, when you use the Latin form of Caesar Nero, you drop a letter. So rather than being Neron Kaiser or Kaiser Neron, it's just Nero Kaiser. And the value of that letter is 50. And so you end up with 616. And so there we have it. It's the number of a man. It's the number that the wise amongst John's audience could calculate, and it identifies the beast with the rest of John's descriptions. So the number of the beast is Caesar Nero, or Nero Caesar. It's identifying him. It's using a code to talk about him. So the great beast in Revelation 13 is the Roman Empire as led by the evil Emperor Nero. And I really do just want to emphasize just how nasty a person he was. You know, there are stories of not only cruelty but sexual perversion. And I apologize, this is quite graphic, but there are stories of him, for instance, castrating a little boy and marrying him. You know, he would dress up in leopard skins and have people chained to posts and attack them and scratch at their genitalia. He killed his own mother and siblings. You know, just a horrible, horrible person. But significantly, he is the one who attacked the church and launched the war against Jerusalem. It was Nero who began the invasion that would eventually see the temple destroyed 42 months later. So he's very, very relevant to the story of Revelation. We can really see his relevance in Revelation. He is the beast that God uses to destroy Jerusalem. Just as God used the Babylonian Empire to destroy Jerusalem the first time, now God uses the Roman Empire to destroy Jerusalem the second time. Now God doesn't condone Babylon, nor does he condone Rome, but he uses them for his purposes. So that's the first beast. The first beast is the Roman Empire. If we look at the second beast, now that we've identified the first beast, it makes the second beast much, much clearer. The first one came out of the sea, but this one is in the land. This one is dependent on the first beast. It only has as much power as the first one allows and is subservient to it. It deceives people, it sends them the wrong way, and rather than royal imagery, it looks like a lamb. Well, this is a description of first century Israel. All of their political power was controlled by Rome. Herod and so on were all installed by the Romans. You know, even the high priest wasn't appointed the way Scripture commanded it to be, but by who was expedient to Rome. You know, Rome chose for them. And this reliance on Rome is seen a number of ways in the New Testament. Think about when Jesus is before the authorities. They say, we can't crucify him, send him to the Romans. And so they go to Pilate, and Pilate says, this man seems innocent. And what do the Jews say? In John 19, they say, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. And then just a few verses later we read, they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. And we see this through Acts as well. You know, the Jews who persecute Christians do so with a reliance on Rome and loyalty to Caesar. So this is what it means by the second beast is dependent on the first beast. Now notice the second beast does what it does to magnify the first beast. They're pointing people away from the Messiah and towards Rome. They're the ones who make the people take the mark of the first beast. And by the way, just in case you're wondering what that mark of the beast is, it's a reference to Deuteronomy 6. So Deuteronomy 6, it says this, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. So this mark of the beast is a symbolic mark of allegiance, not a physical symbol. Just like in Deuteronomy, God wasn't telling them to actually bind something on. It was a symbol of allegiance. Neither the number nor the mark have anything to do with microchips or barcodes. They're about allegiance. They're about things that John's audience would be affected by. So there we have it. We have the two beasts identified. We see their relevance in the story. You know, they're very relevant to this drama. They are some of the main characters, and we see that God uses the beast to achieve his purposes later on. This is very relevant to that story of God ending the old covenant by bringing destruction on Jerusalem. He uses Rome, even though a wicked beast, as his instrument. It's a real testament to the sovereignty of God. So I'm going to finish it there for today. As always, if you want, I'm always up for clarifying things, or if necessary, defending anything I've said. But I hope you've enjoyed that so far, and I'll see you for part 6. So thanks a lot, guys. Bye.